welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. It is so nice to see people in person a little bit more each time. So it's really nice to have that in-person conversation. It makes it really interesting. I think everybody got it, but if you haven't signed up, I would appreciate you just letting me know who you are and that you were here so I can make sure I got a good count. And you can also use that form to sign up for our museum newsletter. And I'll remind you about this every month. My name is Erin Quinn Valcho, and I am the museum curator for the City of Lacey. I'm going to keep my remarks tonight pretty short since I know that people are really interested in this topic, and I suspect that we might have a few questions at the end. So first, there we go. I don't know what to push tonight, apparently. A land acknowledgement. The Lacey Museum is on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically Southern Lushootseed speakers, Nisqually, and the Squaxin Island tribes. We acknowledge and remember not to forget those tribal people that are named but not recognized today and absorbed into other tribes for survival or were relocated. We recognize the ancestors and their relations that are still here. Lacey and the South Puget Sound region are encompassed by the Treaty of Medicine Creek, signed under duress in 1854. We respect and affirm tribal sovereignty, and as a part of the City of Lacey, we work with the Nisqually and Squaxin Island tribes in government-to-government partnership. So coming up in the new year, we do hope you'll join us for our January history talk. Welcome, welcome. And it'll be on the Olympia Brewing Company. During the 1970s, it was ranked the 6th largest brewer in the nation. It was the largest private employer in Thurston County for decades, and its influence has permeated the community for well over a century. Olympia Tumwater Foundation Assistant Director Megan Okerman will present an illustrated history of the brewery, the people who ran it, and its place as a pop culture icon. And I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it too. Also, just a quick note, the Lacey Museum is open Thursdays and Fridays from 11 to 3, Saturdays from 10 to 4. We do have rack cards. If you want to take one and remind yourself to come on by. You can also check out our website at laceymuseum.org. Now for tonight's presentation. We are going to hold our Q&A session at the end, as usual. And we're going to do our best to get both questions from our in-person as well as our live audience online. So if you have any questions, you at home, if you think of during the presentation, just feel free to submit those in the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, or at least it's usually there. Every computer can be different. So it went pretty smoothly the last couple times, so hopefully it still will. Now I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Ulrike. Oh, I can't believe I just did that. I said it like, I already know how to say it, but anyway. Dr. Ulrike Krotscheck, who received her PhD in classics and archaeology from Stanford, and she is an archaeology professor at the Evergreen State College. Thank you so much, Ulrike, for being with us tonight. Here's your thing.
Welcome applause is always good because I haven't even done anything yet, so thank you. And I think we will switch to the other presentation. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to all you folks in the Zoom room. I can't see you, but I feel your presence. And thank you to Erin Quinn Valcho for this invitation. This is my favorite thing to do, is to talk to the public about archaeology. I just like to put in a quick plug for the newsletter too, the Lacey History Museum newsletter. It's super fun, really informative. I really enjoy reading it every time. All right, so how is my microphone? Good, okay. Low?
You can get right up close to it.
I do tend to move a little bit when I'm speaking, so just remind me, maybe somebody go like this or like this if you stop being able to hear me. So, hello, this is my title, the Evergreen State College Bush Homestead Archaeological Field School, 2015 2018 and beyond, because as I was just telling Tony, this is sort of the project that has a continuous afterlife that hasn't stopped yet and hopefully will not. A quick disclaimer before I begin. You heard I have my PhD in classics and archaeology, so that's actually Mediterranean archaeology. And so I come to you today as somebody who has experience in archaeological work here in Washington, but has a narrow knowledge of this particular project and this particular individual and his family. So the way that I have organized this talk, here we go, is I'll talk a little bit about the history of the Bush family. I'll show you where the site that we excavated with Evergreen students is located. I'll talk about some previous work that was done. Uh-oh, reverb. Sorry. Then, I think you have to mute it.
Okay, try it now.
How about now? Perfect. Okay. Sorry, for those of you in the Zoom room, there was reverb. I'll talk about the public outreach that we did or that we started to do. I'll talk a little bit about the things that we found and why they're important, and then I'll come to conclusions and sort of the afterlife of this project. So a quick history. Who were George and Isabella Bush? George Bush was a biracial black man from Missouri, married to a German-American woman in Missouri. He joined the Michael T. Simmons wagon train in 1844 to come to Oregon Territory. He had previously been in Oregon and Washington Territory for work, working for the Hudson Bay Company, and had liked and had decided that he wanted to escape the South and, he's a free black man, of course, and he wanted to escape the South and comes to some place that was new. And so Michael T. Simmons and George Bush and a number of other families traveled from Missouri to the Rogue River Valley in Oregon. And George Bush had been an extremely successful cattle farmer in Missouri and was very, very wealthy. Everybody talks about how wealthy he was and how generous he was. And so there are tales of him hiding bars of gold in between false floors in his wagon and bringing all this seed with him and bringing a bunch of plants and starts with him, so and supporting others financially. So he was really crucial to the operation. And so they came to Oregon Territory and discovered that there had been recently enacted lash laws which prevented people of color from owning property in Oregon Territory. And so the entire wagon train decided they weren't going to stay there, and so they moved north. And they ended up here in Newmarket, which later became Tumwater. It's confusing because I have the presentation on my computer as well. And so there we go. Up until very recently, the best source for the life, or the most comprehensive source of the life of George Bush, George and Isabella Bush, was a master's thesis from the UW from 1965, and that's sort of what we had. But recent interest in this family has meant that now a lot more work has been produced, and I'm going to present some of that to you during this presentation. He wasn't entirely forgotten. For instance, some of you might know that in 1972, the Washington State Legislature commissioned a series of paintings about George Bush and his travels to Washington Territory. They are now at the Washington State Historical Museum. They're rarely on display because they're very sensitive to light, and there's actually an interesting backstory there that I can go into in the Q&A if you feel so inclined. So, where did they settle? George and Isabella. Well, in Nisqually Territory. Here you see a historic survey map. Let's see if I can work this. There we go. Right here, and you can see it's along the road from Olympia to the Cowlitz Landing, right there. So it's south of Olympia, and in the modern survey map, it's right across from the airport. And so if you're going on Capitol and you keep going, and you keep going, and you keep going, that's the airport's on your right, and then it's on the left side. So he had 640 acres there, and I'll go into exactly how it is that he got there. So they settled there. They built a cabin, then they built a home. They had altogether 6 children, one of whom was named Nisqually, whom they raised there. And they lived and farmed there for many generations. In fact, the property, or much of the property, was in the Bush family up until the middle of the 20th century. And we even have a photograph of William Owen Bush's house before its demolition. There it is. Around 1960 or so. And so this is not the original house that was there, but it was a second house that had been moved by Owen Wilson and his family up to the property when he took over after the death of his father, George Bush. There are also some preserved historic photographs that we have. Here you see that very same house plus a large barn and in an undated photograph from the Washington State Archives. Here you have a photograph from 1910 that we know is from the property, and we even have the name of the photographer from the Washington State Historical Society. And then I'll show some more in a bit. The property was purchased in the 1960s by a family that I will get back to towards the end of my talk. And then it changed hands several times. And then just maybe a decade ago or so, it was bought by Mark and Kathleen Clark, who knew of the historic significance of the place that they were buying and were interested in preserving it and highlighting it and learning more about it. And so this is a page from their blog. They run a CSA, or they ran a CSA. I'm not sure if they're still doing it, out of this property. So they are farmers. And they have had a bunch of information on the family and the history of the property that they shared through their business. And I just want to say that this image right there, this is not George Bush. That's an imagination of what George Bush might have looked like, perhaps, but you'll see that image again and again in literature about George Bush. Just know that this isn't him, it's much more likely somebody else. Because there's a little bit of confusion that I have to clear up. George Bush was known as George Washington Bush for a long, long time. He gained a middle name somewhere along the way. We're not entirely sure, but it was after 1965 because Paul Thomas doesn't use it in his thesis. And there are several theories as to why it happened. Oh, it's also not on his gravestone. And my favorite theory about how this happened is there was another prominent African-American founder of a town named George Washington in Centralia, and then there was George Bush up here, and maybe they just got conflated. That's my theory. I can't prove that. But here you have George Washington, who looks an awful lot like that rendering of George Bush, or rather George Bush looks an awful lot like that rendering of George Washington. But we have no images of him. There are no images of him. He didn't like to be photographed, and there are a few images of his sons and grandsons. Okay. Settlers in Washington Territory were entitled to 640 acres of land, but not George Bush, because he was black. And he settled on acreage, but couldn't officially own it until, in particular not because in 1850, the United States Congress passed the Land Donation Act, the Donation Land Act, which prevented people of color from owning land. In Bush's case, however, the territorial legislature got behind him, petitioned Congress, and got Congress to give him a special exemption so that he could rightfully own this land and pass it on to his children. And here you see the first page of that bill for the relief of George Bush of Thurston County, Washington Territory. Of course, he still couldn't vote or anything like that. I have to do, while we're talking about the issue of how his race impacted what he could and could not do throughout his life, I feel the need to point out that if all of you probably read the description of what I was talking about today, and it reads, racism motivated early settlers George and Isabella Bush to travel across the Oregon Trail to Washington Territory, etc. The Bushes came with a well-known Simmons wagon train. They were known as generous members in their new community, et cetera, et cetera. And that maybe sets up the expectation that somehow Washington Territory didn't have racists, but that's not at all what I'm saying here. And Quintard Taylor, emeritus, right before the pandemic, was in this room talking, and I'm just going to repeat what he said, answering a question about why was it that the white settlers in Washington Territory got behind him and made sure that he could own this land. And his response was they needed him. George Bush gave new settlers seed. He would put them up on his property. He was extremely generous. He sheltered people during the Indian Wars. He was absolutely necessary for the health and survival of the community. And so that partly explains that. Okay, back to the site. This one advances it. There we go. So Mark and Kathleen Clark were farming. That means turning over the earth, and they kept finding artifacts after artifacts after artifacts. A lot of them were farming implement artifacts like this. Probably slows down the process somewhat. But they were also finding toys, a tiny little pitcher, an iron leg of a wood stove from circa 1890, a pipe, and then various painted ceramics. And as I had said earlier, they were interested in finding out more about the history of the site. And so they contacted Dr. Dale Crows, who was at the time retired from SPSCC. He's on the left here. And he suggested that they call me. And so I, at the time, was the only working field archaeologist at a college in the region. And so I got the call, and we talked about it and planned it, and ended up doing 2.5 seasons worth of field school at the site, training Evergreen students in archaeological methods. I had some of the work done before me, though. So anytime you have an archaeological project, you're not working as an individual, you're working as a team, and you're working with things that other people have done previously. In my case, there had been, under the previous ownership of the property, there had been an archaeological survey that had been carried out in 2009 by SPSCC, and here you see a photo of that survey. An archaeological survey is where you look at the surface and collect artifacts and mark them and locate them and date them and identify them if you can. And so this survey by SPSCC, Henderson 2009, had come up with lots and lots and lots of artifacts, which is exactly what Mark and Kathleen had been finding. And they had identified main scatters of artifacts on the surface. 2 of them. Here's the building, there's the driveway. One behind the building, and then one off here to the side of the building. This scatter was mostly farm equipment and metal artifacts. This scatter was mostly glass and household artifacts. And right here was the butternut tree. The butternut tree is a tree that George Bush brought with him from Missouri. And it says it fell in 2022. It's actually May of 2021. So I think it's the oldest living known butternut that we know of. And its caretaker is in the audience tonight. So, but it was still there, giving us shade when we were working there. Okay. So we began our work. We worked with the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer of the Nisqually and her team for every single season, Jackie Wall. She's pictured there on the right. That's me, and there's Mark, the landowner. And we started in 2015. It was a summer class. I had very robust enrollment, and we had a series of research questions that we wanted to address. So the goal was to increase the visibility of this history to the greater public, to emphasize its importance, to practice and engage in community outreach, and to make all finds and results publicly accessible. Also to provide archaeological training for students, to encourage visits to the site. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. To carefully do our archaeological work, to gain insight into the daily lives of some of the first non-native settlers of our community, to ensure public access to our results, and to produce further opportunities for research and publication, and then to determine the feasibility of a continuing field school at the site. So that was sort of a short list of our initial goals. And so we began. I was aided by summer undergraduate research fund students, which are students who are paid to help faculty do research in all 3 of the seasons, and here's one of them. And so now there are a whole bunch of fun excavation photos of the site. Lexi Walsh cleaning a glass bottle. Incidentally, our artifacts were all super fragmented, so it was very exciting when we got something that was in one piece. Very exciting. There's Erin Gamble, another research fellow. Don't do this at home. There's Nathan Jeffries working the survey instrument. So I had the chance to train students on survey instruments. This is a total station, although this total station worked about for 5 minutes and then gave up, which is typical. That's Jackie Wall in the background. And this is what it looked like in our first season. We did 1 by 1 meter squares, and everybody got a square, and then they excavated, and they recorded their finds, and we bagged them and cleaned them. There was sieving, you'll see in a minute. And the students all took on, in addition to this work and the lab work, they all took on additional roles for the project. So we had students going to schools and doing school outreach, presentations in middle schools, elementary schools, and high schools. Michael Collin. We had tours, public tours to the site that were led by students. So they had to prepare a tour and a story and show the visitors around the site. There's Annie, who does more school outreach. Here again, I think that's the very same bottle. That must have been the only intact bottle we found, because we were very excited about it. And that's Alexander, Lexi, and Annie in the middle with a little medicine bottle. We found a lot of bottles, as you'll see in a minute. We continued for a second season in 2016. In 2016, I had the benefit, so word was starting to get out about this excavation. We'd already had a bunch of public tours. There were requests for talks and presentations and posters. And I was contacted by Steve Hackenberger, who runs a master's program at Central Washington University in Cultural Resource Management. And he volunteered to bring his ground-penetrating radar out so that we can do subsurface survey. Subsurface survey is where you sort of measure what's underneath the ground. In this case, you were looking for resistivity. And and then you dig. If you find something, you can do it. You can dig a test pit. And so he came and he tested sort of the property just to the southeast of where we were digging, because there was a level spot and we were looking for the house. We really wanted there to be a foundation. And there was some sort of rectangular something that was about house-shaped that the GPR showed. And so we dug, and it was the glacial clay. Which apparently shows up as resistance because it's so dense. But he came, and then we still, after that, so the students had a chance to help with this, and then they had, a second group of students had another regular field season. And then we thought we had pretty well exhausted the area. I'm going to skip forward a few. Oh, there we go. Wait, I was back. There we go. We cleaned everything up. We closed it all up. We put a new penny at the bottom of every one of those units, so for future archaeologists, so that they know that we were here. So in 2016, we thought this is great. We can work everything up. We've pretty much found what there is. There was so much broken stuff. We had lots of work on our hands. But then Mark Clark had to bury a chicken that died. And he tried to bury the chicken about 2 meters or so where our excavation had stopped. And this is another thing about archaeology. It's like no matter where, you're just missing the good stuff, no matter where you are digging. So he was digging a hole to bury this chicken, and he came upon this trash heap, which is, I mean, let's face it, that's kind of what archaeology is looking through other people's trash. He came upon this trash heap, and that contained all sorts of things. In addition, that you see here, springs, more broken glass, warped glass, and then a burned pile of thickly stacked together magazines and papers and books. And that's amazing because paper does not survive in the dirt in Washington, right? I'll show you the paper in a little bit. But so we came back. We came back, and I did it with a skeleton crew. It was essentially the Nisqually and a TIPO team and Aurora Sonnenschein right here. Oh, that's Brad. He's the current TIPO. Aurora's the student to the lower left here, and myself. And just the 5 of us in a couple weeks excavated this burned pile and found a ton more artifacts. Okay, let's see. There we go. There's my before and after. But before I get to the artifacts, I want to talk to you a little bit about the outreach that we did at the time. So we would have site tours every day that we were on site. They were publicly available. We had one of the students make some really nice signs. And so people would come. We had a blog that's hopefully still exists on the internet. We held, and we even, after a week or two, people kept asking me, can we try it? Can our kids are here, can they try it? And so we took a couple of empty units, and we put some artifacts in there that were what we call non-diagnostic, so they don't tell us very much about the past. And for example, a piece of ceramic that didn't have any decoration on it and was maybe flat and white. And so we reburied some of the artifacts, and then we had the kids come and do their own excavation. And they had fun, and the grandparents had fun too. Everybody had fun. We gave them trowels and everything. And so that was part of the outreach, and that was super successful. And then I have a long list of other things that we did at the time that I'm not going to go through right now because I don't need to put you to sleep. But I'll show you some of them. So this resulted in public appearances. It resulted in students presenting at conferences. It resulted in the outreach that I've already mentioned. It resulted in Archaeology Day events, and so on and on and on. Okay. For example, here, Archaeology Month open house. Celebrate archaeology, celebrate Washington, the Bush Homestead in 2015, where we brought out artifacts. I don't have any with me today, sorry, but we actually brought the artifacts. Lexi did a presentation. And then library presentations, historical presentations such as this one. During the dig, we were on the front page of the Olympia twice. They called it a slow news summer, which I believe 2016 was the last slow news summer that we ever had. But so I was happy to be able to exploit the slow news summer of 2015 and 2016. And so you can see here, so this is the students in the lab on the left. And I thought the Olympian did a really good job of this because I didn't mention this earlier, but the way that the day was divided up is that the students would come and excavate in the morning, and then we would have lunch, and it would get hot because it was the summer, and then we'd go back to the lab, and we would spend the afternoon in the lab. And in the lab, the students would clean the artifacts, they would photograph the artifacts, they would classify them and sort them. Sometimes they would weigh them, and then they would enter what we call diagnostic artifacts, which are artifacts that do tell us something about themselves. They would enter them into a series of spreadsheets. And all those spreadsheets are publicly available, plus the photos and everything else. And so the day was really divided into fieldwork in the morning and lab work in the afternoon, and the students got to choose sort of what it is that they wanted to work on at the time. So this is them in the lab trying to, playing the archaeologist's favorite game, which is called What the Heck Is This? I don't know what Annie has in her hand there, but okay. So there was the Olympian, there's Thurston Talk. Oh, and we even got picked up by King 5, and that got distributed as far away as Indiana. And so created some really good press for George Bush, for Evergreen, for the history of Olympia. Oh, we're doing great on time. Something that I'm particularly tickled about that we were able to do is that the students in these field school classes and also in the third season were able to engage, those who chose to, were able to engage with me in the researching and writing of professional reports. And so you can see here that the first report is prepared by myself, Alexis Walsh, and Erin Gamble. And so that means real-world experience, right? That means things that I had to submit this report anyways. That was part of the permitting process in Washington. You have to not only apply for a permit within a certain window before you do any work. I guess this is some important context to add to this conversation. So I can't just like go over there and start digging. That's really not okay. You apply to the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. They send the application out to all possible stakeholders, including all of the tribes. They have a certain amount of time to review the application. Then they come back to you and say yes or no, or yes, but with these provisions. And then at the end, you have to, number one, ensure that the artifacts are well taken care of, and there's really only a few options for that. They're at the Evergreen Archaeology Lab. And two, you have to submit a complete and full report of all of the work that you've done with all the data. And so I was very happy to have some help with that, because as you'll see in a minute, we found a lot of artifacts. So that's the first one, and then we have, these are just the title pages, and then there are, there we go, with me, Emily Launder, Cassandra Johnson, Madeline McGriff, and myself, and Krista Aurora Sonnenschein. And so I was both happy to have help and to have students be able to participate in this process with me. So they really got the whole archaeology from the beginning through the end experience. Okay, so what did we find? I still haven't really shown you anything except for that tiny glass bottle. Just in our first season, we found 4,146 artifacts. A little more in our second season, and then a smaller amount in our third season. I'm just showing you the one slide of the artifact graph as an example, because they get pretty repetitive and boring after a while. But if you'll notice, there's a lot more glass than anything else. So we mainly found glass, ceramics, metals, organics, material, and then organic material. Occasionally, we'd find the plastic toothbrush. Because where we were digging, and this is also why the artifacts were so fragmented, it had been a farm for 140 years. So that earth had been plowed over and over and over again. And so that's why we have so many of them. They're all fragments. So mostly glass. And in fact, what the students would say when they were excavating, they would say, oh, another whiskey bottle. They were having keggers and just tossing all the glass over here in a big pile, and that's kind of what it looked like. And even during Prohibition, there would be the little medicine bottles that had alcohol in them but weren't alcohol, and we would find remains of those. So mostly glass. But there were other artifacts as well. We found some amazing metal artifacts. We found a lot of metal artifacts overall. I'll just show you I'll show you 4 of them. We found two examples of a Puget Sound felling axe. And these are axes that are specifically designed to fell the trees in this region. They have a very specific shape. I do not work in lumber, and so don't ask me why they work exactly how they do. But we found 2 of them, and both of them were broken along the handle, which I thought was really interesting. We found a number of barrel rings. We found horseshoes. We found mule shoes. I don't have a picture of the mule shoe with me, but I'll show you where you can find one. And this is a hinge. And the mule shoe is particularly interested because the way that you shoe oh, sorry, did I say mule shoe? Ox shoe. Ox shoe, thank you. I said mule shoe, I meant ox shoe. The way that you shoe an ox is you have to lift it up. And so you need a pulley mechanism to lift up the ox. And I learned all this, right? Like I learned all this from people who would come to the site and say, oh, look at what that is. And I'd say, tell me about it. And they'd tell me about it. I said, oh, good, thank you. I didn't switch to the other slide. Here we go. They're the horseshoes. Horseshoes, hinges, lots of nails, lots of pikes and things like that, and really so many nails that it looked like there would have been, and then later we found out through historical record, there was a metal shop that was right around there. So there was lots of metal. There was also lots of glass and glass-like things, and so this probably doesn't look like much. We found a lot of things that don't look like much, to be honest. You're sort of seeing the highlights. But there were many, many, many of these, and these are liners for canning jars. And so before we had the little rubber on top of the canning jar that you use to make your jam, there would be these milk glass liners, and they were made from 1869 on. And then there's some more information. This particular piece wasn't produced after 1871, but then they continue on until the 1950s. So lid liners are not great for sort of chronological narrowness because they exist for a long amount of time. But we have some artifacts that are great for chronological narrowness. We have some imported ceramics from England. And so this, I don't have a scale on that, which is an archaeologist no-no. But it's about 2 centimeters wide. It's tiny, tiny, tiny. And all that we have is this part that you see here, and it's called the maker's mark. I can't get it to work, but I'm sure you can see it. And turns out, using just like 1/3 of that maker's mark, Kelson McConnell, my student, figured out that it was from Staffordshire, England, and this was in use between 1833 and 1846. Whether they brought this with them or whether they purchased it at Fort Nisqually or something like that, we don't know, but they definitely had imported ceramics. Here's another one. Staffordshire Trent potteries between 1861 and 1951 that we found. Here we have a tiny fragment of a dedicatory plate, or commemorative plate, I should say, of Theodore Roosevelt's second inauguration. Very specific, very specific. Then we have some cute little glass bottle tops for perfume bottles or so on. Lots and lots of jars. So now I get to the glass. So this is a Vaseline jar from Chesbrough, I don't know how to pronounce that, New York, from 1877. Whiskey bottles, as I was just saying. I wasn't kidding. The Duffy Malt Whiskey Company in business between 1870 and 1886. And let's see, is that the end of my artifacts? Oh, no. And then some random things. A Dr. Scholl's shoe insert. That was used the specific type was used between 1904 and the 1930s. And then, of course, the paper. And that's the last artifact or set of artifacts that I'm going to talk about. So when you try and remove a stack of burned paper from the ground, it falls apart. It's all carbonized. It's very difficult to conserve. We didn't have a budget for a conservator. And so we did the best that we could. And then the students went into the lab with red light and magnifying glasses and ruined their eyes, helping figure out what these things were. And they did a phenomenal job figuring out what something that looked like that, when it was from, and what it was about. And here you see on the right, you see how it is that we bagged individual pieces of paper that gave us information on what this was. And they found the Century Illustrated Monthly Magazine, the Art Amateur, and a number of not Sears catalogs, but catalogs like the Sears catalog, and a number of other sort of like literary magazines. So rather than books, the Bush family was receiving magazines, and they were reading them. And the way that they identified the precise dates is through the advertisements in the magazines. And so advertisements are extremely chronologically specific. I mean, nobody would have ever seen a cloth mask advertised before March of 2020. Right? And So in the past, they are specific as well. Here are some of my favorites. They get up in the night to eat Macintosh's toffee. Moorish, the more you eat, the more you want. King's Windsor asbestos cement. Didn't age well. Fire and waterproof, though. Long underwear. Harder fold Red Star brand. Durham smoking tobacco. Crandall typewriters. Mahler's cod liver oil. And Ypsilanti underwear. And that's my favorite. It says something like, if you wear regular underwear, one flight of stairs will make it all skew, and so you have to wear Ypsilanti underwear. And of course, these aren't the actual advertisements. These are things that the students then went to the internet to find exact replicas of. And so I guess what I want to highlight here is that they did an incredible job of taking extremely fragmented and minute, tiny little pieces of evidence and really building a narrative about these people. And that was all of them. Okay. So what does that lead us to? Here are my conclusions. That historical reputation that the Bushes had is corroborated through the evidence. They were clearly able to import ceramics. They were literate. They had a metal shop. They could shoe an ox. Not a mule, an ox. Mules too, I'm sure, but importantly, oxen. They had lots and lots of equipment that they needed to be there, which meant lots of buying power. We never did find those gold bars, but that's okay. The fragmentary evidence gives us that narrative even without them. So that is the, I didn't switch the slide. This is the slide I meant to show. There we go. And I'll leave it up for a minute. Then what happens? Well, this link, which hopefully will be available, I can make available, shows how the land was placed under permanent conservation. They got the Clark family got a conservation easement, and so that it can never be developed. And if you know that area of Olympia, there's a lot of industrial development there, but that piece of land is protected now for perpetuity. Another thing that happened, the Payne family collection. So the Payne family was the family who bought the property in the 1960s. The son, who was young in the 1960s, heard about our dig, came out with a trunk full of artifacts that they had collected from the old house, and they were hanging on to. And they were just kind of in the garage in boxes. And so that's him in the background there, and that's Annie, and Annie's about as excited as I'm feeling. And so all of those documents and artifacts have now been transferred to the Washington State Archives, and they wouldn't have gone anywhere otherwise. Knut Berger, who is an Evergreen graduate and has a historical mini-series called Mossbacks Northwest, did one of his short episodes on George Bush. Notice he's using the wrong image there. So we got PBS media coverage in addition. And lots and lots of other things happened, all that outreach that I was talking about. But just recently, on November 19th in 2021, George Bush got a permanent marker on the Capitol State campus, where there's also a butternut tree. And in fact, an identical one is planned for WSU, which William Owen Bush, George Bush's son, who I neglected to mention, served twice in the first state legislature. He promoted the bill for founding the institution that became WSU. And so that's why the marker is going there. And in addition, although the butternut tree has fallen, there are many butternut trees that have been planted throughout the community in the Isabella Bush Park. I'm not going to get them all right now, on Evergreen campus, and on the Capitol campus, of course, and many other locations that I'm not remembering. And so there's, actually that's not all. There has been work to try to take the Washington out of George Bush's name, because it was there, and after much effort, Wikipedia conceded to have this little note about the name, which I think is a great victory. And I heard just tonight that the name change is also happening on a federal level, and that I know a lot less about. Yes. And so in all, this work, which still continues, you see me here today, I think has reached our goal that I stated initially on one of my earliest slides, to make the history of this family more apparent, more well-known, and more recognized in the community. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I now want to invite people to ask questions, and I ask you to please use the microphone so that everybody who is at home and when it's on the recording later can hear your question. And I'll also be fielding questions from the online audience. So does anybody have anything to start off with? All right, I'll come bring you the mic. Here you go.
I don't know, Tony. It's
Thank
going to
you,
be hard.
Ulrike. That was as even more fascinating than the one you did a few years ago. So thank you very much. Two questions, if I may. One is, what was the nature of the farming activity there? Was it mostly dairy? Was it mostly agriculture? Do we know, what they used the land for?
Well, we know that William Owen Bush won many, many, many awards for his wheat. Yes, so that's what it became.
And my second question is, did you, in your excavations, come across any native artifacts at the site?
Great question. Yes, we did. And so the agreement says, our permit agreement says that if we come across any native artifacts, we turn them over to the Nisqually. The Tipo didn't have to, Jackie didn't have to be there every day, but I think she enjoyed hanging out with us. And so she was there both days that we found our native artifacts, and they were trade beads. We found 4 teeny little trade beads, just very, very small. They were blue. We gave them to the Nisqually. They have them now. And we found them, in one of the earliest slides, you saw people with sieves, with like big wooden frames. So all of the dirt that we excavated, we would dump into big stand-up sieves and shake them back and forth. And that's how they were found. And had we not been using that method, they would have never been found. But yeah, that's all. So not very much.
Okay, we have an online question. This person says, how do you determine the necessary depth of the pits that are excavated? And I assume the penny you place at its base before refilling is a current year. That's wicked awesome. That's what they said.
It is wicked awesome. So it's called sterile soil in archaeology, and essentially when you stop finding artifacts. And our sterile soil happened after just about 20 or 30 centimeters, because apparently like the plow doesn't go all that far down. And because we were on a slope going towards the river, there would have been erosion as well. And so that further reduces the depth of the archaeologically rich strata. Great question.
Are there any direct descendants of George Bush still living anywhere in the area that we know of?
Great question. And actually, before that, I just have to answer the second question of the first question, which I forget to answer. Yes, they were new pennies. And yes, so we didn't think so. We didn't think so, because the Bushes had a lot of kids, but their kids didn't have a lot of kids. It turns out there are descendants. But which I just found out very, very recently. So this is very new to me. So, yes, would you like to? Yes.
Can you say that again in the mic?
Sorry, I didn't want to just like out you.
So my name's Brandon Staff. I'm a direct descendant of the Bush family. Learned this years ago, and I'm working with Ray Gleason on the Bush butternut tree. He's been doing great work on it. So thank you all for coming to this talk, and I'm always eager to learn more about my family history.
Thank you.
It's really cool. Thank you.
If you didn't want to talk, I didn't want to just like say, stand up, but I'm so glad you came. Yes, for a long time we didn't think so. So for a long time we couldn't find anybody, but recently, yeah. It's awesome. Wicked awesome.
Okay, so we have another online question. With the pervasive racism, how was it possible that a black man and his family was so successful?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think they were extraordinary. They were Quakers. They were in an interracial marriage. George Bush's father had been in an interracial marriage with an Irish woman, and that's really a question for the ages. George Bush had a lot of property coming through to him through his family, but then he grew that, and so I think through assets and George Bush's legendary generosity, there came I don't want to claim acceptance or something like that, but a certain amount of power that he had. The power to join this wagon train, the ability to help other people with his seed, so they could start their homesteads. So yeah, that's a really imperfect answer to that question, but it's a good one.
Are there any other questions from our in-person audience? There's one up here. Okay, thank you. I didn't see the hand. Here you go.
Thank you. It's not really a question, but my uncle, by marriage, his grandmother was Mandana, who married Owen.
Yes.
And we got from the family a beautiful set of andirons that were kind of crappy looking, but my ex-husband got them all cleaned up, and they're one of my son's favorite things. He's really into history and genealogy, and that's one of his favorite things.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that.
So while I'm going back here, I have a question that's kind of just archaeology related, not specific to the Bush Archaeology Project. But I often get people who want to know what to do with things that they have, artifacts they've picked up off the ground or found in a park. Could you talk about what people should do in those circumstances when they see an artifact in the ground?
Sure. And the easiest thing to do is to call the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation or the Burke Museum. They both have phone lines for that. And then depending on where it is that you are and what kind of artifact it is, they will tell you what it is that you ought to do. There are different rules for European colonial artifacts versus Native American artifacts, different laws, I should say. There are different rules for private property, your private property, public property, federal land, and so on. And so the best way to determine what to do is to ask an expert. And don't move it. Or if you do move it, locate exactly where it was that you found it, because once you move it from where it is that you found it, the context is kind of lost. And so don't move it very far, or don't move it at all, or find some way of recording the exact location. Even though, of course, on the surface, things can move all the time.
We did get a couple of questions before the talk. So this person asks, in June of 2016, Central Washington University performed a small GPR survey as part of a field school project on the property where the original butternut tree stands. Did any of the GPR data ever assist in the excavations or identifications related to the Bush Homestead?
Yeah, that's the one that I was talking about earlier.
I thought you touched on that a little bit.
Yeah. So yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, they were false positives, and we found clay. But we did get to dig some fun shovel test pits in the process, which is a very important part of Washington State archaeology, shovel test pits. I'm looking for the... There we go. There's Steve.
Nice. Oh, this is a good question. This person asks, who owns the artifacts and how will they be stored and preserved?
So because these are not native artifacts, the Clarks technically own the artifacts. They are storing some of them. Some of them are being stored at the ones that we excavated are being stored at the Evergreen Archaeology Lab in dry storage. We don't have anything, well, we do have some particularly fragile things, but you've seen we have the paper in the museum bags and it's climate protected. And that's where the artifacts are right now. The artifacts also travel. I use them for teaching. When I do interactive stuff with kids, the artifacts come with me, and so the kids get to like hold the artifacts, and we play the what the heck is this game. It's great to have them held locally because it means that we can continue to learn from them.
I want to play that game.
It's a good game, especially when you're dealing with farm equipment and you know nothing about farming.
I play that game in the museum too.
Yes.
When you were describing all of the stuff that your students were doing, that's exactly how I got into museum work, was in the lab at an archaeology dig. Okay, we have another online question. Can you expand on the commissioned paintings about George Bush that are too fragile to display often? What are the paintings of, and why did they choose such a sensitive medium, if you know the answer to those questions?
Yeah, so that's a reach for me. That's a reach for me. And somebody in the audience might know better, so I'm going to tell you what I know. They were commissioned for the state capitol in 1972 by the Washington State Legislature, but they were never displayed there. And the circumstances why I am a little foggy on, but they were in storage for a long time. They were at Centralia College for a long time, community college, and now they are in the collection of the Washington State History Museum. There was an exhibit recently that displayed them, but I think its photosensitivity is the problem. From what I understand, is that light fades.
What's the medium? Do you know?
I think it's acrylic.
Because acrylic isn't that photosensitive.
It's not. Yes, I don't. Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know.
I don't know. That's I got that from the Washington State History site because I was also curious, where are they now? And they are in their holdings. But if anybody in the audience knows more of the story. Oh, we have somebody who knows more of the story. Please.
To be clear, I don't know anything specific about the medium. I'm not an artist. I'm a historian of sorts. But I wanted to point out that the paintings are by Jacob Lawrence, yes, who is one of the most acclaimed American artists of the 20th century. And he focused a great deal of his painting on African-American history. I think he's perhaps best known for his migration series. There was a recent exhibit within the last year or two of a bunch of his work at the Seattle Art Museum. All of his work is wonderful. I wish those paintings could be displayed more. I think they're at the Capitol Museum right here. That's my understanding. That's part of the State Historical Society's holdings. And it's where I was lucky enough to see them quite some years ago now. But it's interesting on the subject that you touched on earlier on the name, because as I say, Jacob Lawrence was, he did the paintings in the early 70s. He was very well researched in African-American history. I doubt he would confuse two different African-American men. The title that Jacob Lawrence gave to his paintings is the George Washington Bush. So it's interesting. It's just a historic footnote there. But if you ever hear that they are being displayed, I would highly recommend getting to see them.
Thank you so much for that additional information and for the context of Jacob Lawrence. Got another.
I'm coming. Thank you.
I'm going to add a little bit to this. If you would like to see 4 panels of his paintings, they're at the kiosk near Kippert's Corner, which is really close to the old Bush property, and it was established by Thurston County Historic Commission several years ago. Unfortunately, it does use the word Washington for a middle name because we did not know at the time, but I'm a former chairman of the Historic Commission, and we established that. And the kiosk, it was done by an architect who was a member of the Historic Commission, and the kiosk is in the shape of the windows and roof line of the house that oftentimes you see the families in front, and in the background is a house. And if you look at the window dormers and what have you, that was a takeoff on the kiosk, and it will reflect that. Again, I don't remember the street number, but it's at Kipper's Corner. It's an old feed store that's on the corner there. It's right next door, and you can't miss it. There's an old farm wagon on the front lawn part of it, and so you're encouraged to see it, and you'll see 4 panels here. And one of the paintings shows George Bush in a snowstorm during the trip to the Oregon country. It's an artistic liberty because he never went through a snowstorm.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for adding that additional context. Aaron is coming for the microphone. This is why it's so good to have local historical experts at these
Well,
talks.
we're just about, thank you so much. We're just about at time. Does anyone have any final questions, comments? All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Krotscheck.
Thank you.
We
Thank you for
appreciate
coming.
it.